Hi, welcome to From Here Forward, a UBC Podcast Network podcast. I'm Rumneek, and she's Carol.
Hello, friendly alumni. Today is a bit of a different vibe because it's not just the two of us. We are joined by Jeevan, From Here Forward's newest co-host. So if you've been a fan of Rumneek's voice, I'm really sorry to say she's a goner. We're parting ways, kind of amicably. So Rumneek, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I will miss your mysterious accents that are very difficult to place. So thank you so much, Carol. It is true, I am departing from here forward. I've been working on that one for a while. And I am truly so sad to bid all of you farewell. I've learned a lot, laughed a lot, and probably cried a lot. But I am excited that you will have a very talented and intelligent UBC alum taking my place.
I can tell you practiced that. It came off very HR. Since my dear friend Rumneek is leaving from here forward, and I will be going through the 5 stages of grief, we thought it would be a good idea to have our new host to join us and say hello, because, you know, it's mostly for those of us who struggle with change to get better acquainted. So without further ado, hi, Jeevan.
Hello. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for the kind words and the warm welcome. I am sharing similar feelings of grief about Rumneek leaving, but I'm also super excited to be joining the team and to continue to spark some really important conversations. Well, and now that we've all been acquainted and wiped our tears, we have a very insightful and important interview to share. It's no secret that this past summer was scary, heartbreaking, and traumatic for British Columbians. Many lost their homes, while others had to evacuate while their cities burned. Canada also mourned the losses of firefighters who died battling the aggressive fires. We've all heard it before, but the climate is in crisis. In BC, this means that wildfires will burn earlier, longer, and bigger.
So we connected with Dr. Lori Daniels, who is a professor of forest ecology in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. Her research focuses on dynamics of forests, including wildfires, human impacts, and climate change, and all of their interactions. At this point, I am a broken record, but I'm going to say it anyway. Dr. Daniels is such a cool person. She explained how we, the world, but mostly BC, got here with these intense wildfires, where we, aka the province, went wrong, but more importantly, how to move forward. We talked about the mental health impacts of wildfires, including the trauma individuals can experience from being forced to relocate and leave their homes behind.
We hope you learned something from our conversation with her. Here's Dr. Danielle.
Tell us kind of how you got into this field, how you got into your expertise, that backstory.
Yeah, I have always been interested in the outdoors. I grew up with a family who did lots of camping and lots of hiking and outdoors work. So I was absolutely thrilled as an undergraduate student to be given opportunities to join research teams as a research assistant. So I worked on Tallgrass Prairie in the city of Winnipeg on one of the preserves where we used fire and other mechanisms to restore remnant grassland right in the center of the city. I moved from Manitoba, where I did my undergraduate degree in ecology. I came out to British Columbia to do my master's degree and had opportunities to work in coastal temperate rainforests, looking at the dynamics of old-growth cedar and hemlock forests, a project or an area of research that I've had ongoing now for 35 consecutive years. And I've had opportunities to work in South America, in the Andes, on climate change impacts, on high-elevation forests at Treeline in northern Patagonia, and then came home to Canada, to British Columbia, where I have been based at the University of British Columbia in faculty positions studying forest ecology and these amazing systems in British Columbia ever since 2000.
Wow, what a trajectory. Like, that is incredible. Also, your experience in South America sounds amazing. I want to bring it back to the local context, though. There is obviously a lot of doom and gloom and smoke in BC. I mean, not anymore, but when we were supposed to meet, there was a lot of doom and gloom and smoke. But in some parts of BC, there still is, due to wildfires. So what is contributing to the fires that we see that have been increasing in recent years all across the province?
Yeah, and even I'm going to digress just for a moment because you've made a really good point. Here we are, it's the 15th of September. Wildfire season is nowhere near over. We have 397 fires still burning in the province. We've had a record-breaking fire season. The biggest fire on record is still burning. It has been since May in the northeast of the province. It will probably burn over winter and into next summer is our expectation at this point with the Donny Creek fire. And of course, hundreds of people are still out of their homes or on evacuation alert because of this fire season. So what is driving this? I would say there's three big elements that have converged into this perfect storm. So one is the extreme fire weather that we've experienced this year related to climate change. That is superimposed on a landscape that has a 100-year legacy of land use change, of changes to the way fire and forests function, making them more susceptible than ever before in fire-prone environments. And then third, there are more and more of us living in these fire-prone ecosystems. Our communities are expanding as our populations grow, and we're sometimes expanding into those fire-prone environments in very naive ways.
Just for clarity, so when you say that the expectation of the fire season will kind of continue through winter, like, does that literally mean like it will continue or it'll kind of stop and then it'll keep going? Like, to the average person, what does that mean?
Yeah, there's a new term that's become really popular that describes fires that burn through the winter below ground. They're called zombie fires. The fire will move underground and continue to smolder and burn organic material or underneath the ground surface, even covered with snow. And then in the summer, with the snow melts, or in the spring when the snow melts and we get warm, dry conditions again, usually on days where you get a little bit of wind as well, when it's warm and dry, those fires will pop up to the surface and form flames again and continue to burn. We saw it on the Elephant Hill fire in 2017, was still burning in the spring of 2018. And even many people might remember the huge fire, the Horse River fire that burned through Fort McMurray. That fire started on May 1st, 2016, and was not declared out until midsummer of 2017. Incredible, isn't it? I can see the look on your face.
Brain is just like, what? So is that normal, or is that something that climate change has contributed to? Like, is that something that
it's a combination? It's a phenomenon that we have seen with fires forever. Fires burn with flaming combustion, so where we openly see those flames, but there's also smoldering combustion, and smoldering combustion can be the part that's below ground, stored in the soil, especially if you have organic soils or peaty soils. However, those soils, in order to continue smoldering and burning, also have to be dry. And so climate change is priming our northern fires or forests in particular for fire. When the above ground parts of the ecosystem, the logs and the trees are stressed, or the logs are dried out because of drought, the trees are stressed because of drought, but also the soil become exceptionally dry. And in northern ecosystems where peatlands, so organic bogs and wetlands, intermix with our forests, we would expect wetlands not to burn, except under drought conditions. They dry out and they become susceptible to fire as well. And when they burn, they emit huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So it's not just the above ground trees and vegetation, but we're burning right into the soils, emitting carbon into the atmosphere, and then changing those soils, burning the seed banks and the potential for regeneration of that vegetation with long-term consequences.
Wow, not at all stressful. Not being Carol.
No. And imagine too, so to add, more doom to my gloom here, imagine the feedbacks that are occurring. We know that hot, dry conditions are creating prolonged droughts that dry out these forests and make both the dead portions of the forest, the logs and the snags that we expect to dry out and be burnable, but also the living trees that hold water in their needles and tissues. Well, when they're dried out in drought and become susceptible to burning and fire occurs, we burn a lot of material emitting carbon into the atmosphere. That carbon in the atmosphere now contributes to global warming, which generates future droughts and potential for these large fires. And the feedback is substantive. We know this year, for example, in Canada, we have burned 17.5 million hectares of forests, and those forest fires have emitted over 400 megatons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. That's equivalent to all other sectors of carbon emissions in Canada in the entire year. So wildfires are contributing to the problem of climate change and are being fed by the climate change problem as well.
Thank you for that. So on the next question kind of pertains to your research. So you've given us a lot of information on the hows and the whys and the what's happening right now. What role does your research play in helping understand BC's forests and forest fires? And how can we kind of use the information that you're actively gaining from being out in the field to get a sense of where the situation is and where it's going and perhaps solutions as well?
Yeah, so our research, the research group in the tree ring lab at UBC that I direct, we do transdisciplinary research. So we work not only on Western science, but we have been working with Indigenous knowledge holders to marry their knowledge with the knowledge that we can gain through our scientific studies. And then we also do collaborative applied research working with community forests or with Indigenous communities who are doing fuels mitigation work in and around the forests surrounding their communities. We work with them and fire behavior specialists to test and understand the effectiveness of the treatments that we're putting on the land. So if I step back, our tradition, my lab, as tree ring scientists, we use tree rings to understand not just the age of trees, but to reconstruct the histories of how forests have developed over many centuries. And what we've discovered is that in the dry forests of BC, in the southern interior of BC, forest fires used to be extremely common. So fires would burn in any given patch of forest once every 10 to 25 years. However, those fires were low-intensity surface fires, kind of good fires in the landscape. They would burn through the understory, cleaning up the dead needles and leaves and branches that had accumulated in previous years. But they were not intense enough to kill the trees. The larger trees that have thick bark were protected from those fires. And so what those fires did was maintain open forest structures intermixed with grasslands and created an ecosystem that was functioning driven by fire. What we also know from our tree ring studies is that those fires stopped in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We know now that that was a combination of multiple factors. The removal of Indigenous people from their traditional lands, where they were stewarding the land and managing it actively using fire. Repeat good fire or cultural fire stewardship on the landscape contributed to those surface fires, alongside lightning ignitions that would also burn those fires through the landscape historically, as we see today. The other factors that stopped those fires would be European settlement, our changes in land use, and then our desire to detect and suppress fires. In BC, we've been very, very effective at doing this. Since about the 1970s, we have successfully put out over 90% of fires that start in the province, which means in our lifetimes, we've only seen the top 6 or 8% of fires that started. Those fires burn under extreme fire weather conditions. They are fast-moving fires that are intense and are very difficult to control. So our experience with fire is only the portion that has the damaging impacts. We are missing from the entire contemporary fire regime all the good low-intensity fire that help to maintain ecosystems, regenerate plants in the understory, recycle nutrients, and maintain healthy ecosystems. The third component that relates to that is as these fire regimes were disrupted, historically, we see more and more trees growing into the landscape. So today we have more trees in the forests. They're denser. There's more dead trees contributing to branches and logs down on the ground. And also we see forests encroaching into woodlands and grasslands so that our landscapes are more homogeneous and they're loaded up with fuels. So today, when fires start and a lightning ignition in the landscapes today are landing into forests that have fuel loads in them that exceed historic levels and landscapes that are very, very uniform with abundant fuels across them. So fires start, they're more intense and severe today. They tend to be fast spreading and they can grow to much larger sizes. This is the mega fire era that we find ourselves living in today, an unintended consequence of very effective fire suppression. It was a good intention to try to control fires, thinking all of them were bad, but the portion that we controlled best were actually contributing in a positive way to the ecosystem. And we've essentially eliminated them from today's landscapes.
So is that what people call like the fire suppression paradox? Is that what that is?
Yeah, so that's the fire suppression paradox. The irony that trying to protect the forest from fire means that we've created landscapes and forests that are more susceptible to fire than ever before. And then the double paradox is that, in fact, reintroducing fire is part of the solution. Remember, fire is the factor that used to thin out those forests and maintain sustainable and healthy ecosystems. So we either need to reintroduce fire, or we need to manage the forests in ways that is consistent with how those fires functioned. And so much of our restoration, ecological restoration in those dry forests and mitigation of fuels, they overlap and dovetail because fuels mitigation in those ecosystems that are so susceptible today means thinning out the understory trees, removing the fuels that act as ladder fuels between the surface where fires start and the canopy of the trees where it can spread and be very damaging. We want to thin out those understory trees, remove the ladder fuels, but leave the biggest trees. The biggest trees have thick bark, they're adapted to fire, they create shade, they provide seed sources for future trees, and they also provide critical habitat for many species. So we can restore ecosystem structure and function, and we can reduce the amount of fuels in these dry forests simultaneously through proactive measures.
I guess maybe this is on kind of line of questioning or what you've been talking about. How is UBC kind of in your research or your faculty leading the way in terms of thinking of or considering potential solutions versus dwelling solely on the doom, which is what we really see as a much, an important and necessary part of this conversation. But how is your folks' research centering on solutions?
Yeah, we have worked with communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, extensively over the last decade to understand, to work with them to understand what are the conditions of the forests around communities, what is the fire history and how has it been altered through these different factors or ways, what is the consequence for the condition of the forest, and then worked specifically to measure what is the abundance of fuels in the forest. We've used fire behavior models to then determine what is the risk of a crown fire in those forests, and then work with communities who are implementing, either planning or implementing fuels mitigation exercises and treatments to measure the impacts of those treatments before and after they've altered the forest to ensure that after the condition of the forest after the treatments has actually reduced the chance of crown fire. So we measure the trees, we measure the amount of wood there is on the ground. We use computer models to figure out, are they still susceptible to a crown fire even after the treatment? Do we need to enhance those treatments even more? And then give guidance on whether or not they've achieved their goals. And this helps communities then to be confident that the types of treatments that are being implemented on the land are going to be effective and help to resist fire and make them more resilient to fire into the future. And we have some great examples of success. We've worked extensively, for example, with Logan Lake among 10 other community forests, and fire burned right up to the edge of the community of Logan Lake in 2021. It burned into part of the forest where they had done treatments, and as expected, the fire moved from being a crown fire. It became surface fire when it moved into the forest where they'd removed the ladder fuels and removed some of the trees to reduce the density. And that created defensible space for firefighters and the community forest managers to set up sprinklers and to be able to defend the community from fire. And they were very successful. No homes were lost in that community, despite a very powerful fire moving toward them that burned at very high intensity, only hundreds of meters from the edge of town.
There is a positive in this whole doom and gloom.
There absolutely is a positive. And so here's the important thing for us to remember. There's multiple factors that are contributing to this wildfire emergency we find ourselves in. Climate change is the umbrella over top, but underneath is the condition of the forest. And we know enough about how our forests used to function, how they are functioning today, and the difference between those. We know the susceptibility has to do with our choices about wildfire management and forest management. And so we can change the way that we are managing the forest. We can change the forest to make it more resilient to fire. And then we can use multiple tools in our toolbox, thinning from below, cutting out the small trees and reducing those fuel loads, combining that with prescribed fire, surface fires, good fire back on the land in the spring and the fall under the right conditions. So they'll burn at low intensity to maintain those open forest conditions, sustain a healthy ecosystem. We're learning by listening carefully and working with Indigenous communities about how cultural fire stewardship used to maintain landscape like this, and how we can combine Western science with Indigenous knowledge to reintroduce fire back onto lands around Indigenous communities and more broadly on their traditional territories to increase fire resilience. So that's another way in which we've been very innovative and transdisciplinary. Learning to walk on two legs, a lesson I've learned from Kukbi Ron Ignace, who is an Indigenous knowledge holder from the Skeechesan First Nation and a scholar who completed his PhD at Simon Fraser University, who is one of our collaborators with the Secwepemc people. And so we have learned from him this concept of bringing together Western science with Indigenous knowledge in partnership, but to be led by the Indigenous values on their traditional territories so that we can use the science to support and revitalize cultural fire practices and other ways of restoring the land so that it is more resilient to climate change, more resilient to fire, but also sustains values for multiple cultures, Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures across that land.
Obviously, we've heard a lot about wildfires happening in Canada over the summer and, like you said, as early as May of this year. Are similar things happening in other forested areas, whether it's like Scandinavia or it's like Russia, that are equally impacted with wildfires? Is it a similar kind of process, or does it just depend on where you are in the world?
Yeah, I would say it even depends on where you are in British Columbia. I have just described to you in detail much of what's happening in the southern interior of BC, where those surface fires were such a key component of the ecosystem. So maybe this is a good time to point out that both understanding how fire functioned in ecosystems, how forests have changed, and how those two pieces of information can help guide us into future solutions. We need to be ecosystem specific. And in BC, we live in such a large and diverse province. What we do in the southern interior of British Columbia is different from what we would do in the northern part of British Columbia, where the fire played out differently on the landscape. Stand replacing or intense crown fires were more part of the natural fire cycle and fire regime in those landscapes. And in those landscapes, much of the change that has happened has been in terms of the spatial patterns. We've tried to kind of use forest harvesting to replace fire on the landscape. We thought we could put out fires, and then instead of having fires burn the trees, we would harvest the trees and then grow back forest, as you would imagine a forest would grow back after fire. We've missed some subtle but important differences between how fire works and how forest harvesting works. And part of that is the spatial arrangement of the patches of forest that are created by fire versus harvesting. And also the post-fire patterns of regenerating our trees. After fire, under natural conditions, we get a mix of broadleaf trees and needleleaf trees that grow back. The broadleaf trees mixed with the needleleaf trees add to the resilience of the landscape, both within a patch of forest and across the landscape, because broadleaf forests tend to burn differently than conifer forests. The broadleaf forests are more resistant to those intense crown fires, except under the most extreme fire weather conditions. So having broadleaf trees mixed into the forest actually adds to resilience and increases our success when we're trying to control fire by having reduced or changed fire behavior that makes it easier to try to use those sites in the landscape as anchor points where you could manage fire and more successfully put it out. With our industrial forest management, we tend to manage only for the conifers. When we when we are trying to regenerate a forest, we plant the needleleaf trees, the pines, the spruces, and the firs, and we try to control the broadleaf trees, thinking they only had negative impacts on the growth of the needleleaf trees. So those broadleaf trees, we would cut them down by brushing them out, or we would use herbicides, glyphosate-based herbicides, to try to eliminate those broadleaf trees from the forest, thinking that was enhancing our timber production, making sustainable timber products. What we didn't realize, again, an unintended consequence, was to reduce the resilience of that patch of forest and the landscape as a whole to fire. and to other climate-mediated disturbances like insects and pathogens. So we're learning now that lengthening the cycle of forest regeneration after harvesting, allowing the broadleaf trees to be part of the mix and a natural part of regeneration, even if it slows down the total growth and the total yield of the needleleaf trees, is probably in our best interests, especially given the kinds of extreme insect outbreaks and wildfires that we have seen driven by warming summer climates in recent years. So there's a lot of benefit in rethinking our management of forests to make them more resilient, not only in the warm, dry forests in BC, but even our subboreal and boreal forests. And I would say that the lessons we can learn in the boreal forests apply across Canada as well. Yeah, and if we take that out globally, we still see, there's some broad principles that apply when we look at fires and how they behave, and that determines their fire effects. There's some underlying principles that are standard. Fire behavior is driven by weather, fuels, and topography. We have good, strong scientific understanding how those three combined, regardless of what forest type or ecosystem type we are in the world. And so we know that weather component is being influenced by climate change globally. We also know that our impacts on vegetation, whether it's forest or other flammable or burnable vegetation, is strongly influenced by our land use choices and our management choices the world around. And so we're beginning to learn hard lessons in very many places about how some of our choices to manage ecosystems to try to maximize economic gain from them are having consequences in terms of reduced resilience and more susceptibility to wildfire. And so that's going to require us rethinking where our priorities are in the landscape and to begin to rethink how we manage that vegetation. In British Columbia, that's going to mean really transformative changes in our forest management so that we think about our forests as landscapes and landscapes that need to be resilient to climate.
The wildfires had the smoke, and then, people weren't really able to inhale clean oxygen. What other health threats are there to our well-being as people moving in these kind of spaces?
So we know, for example, during fire season, when there's smoke in the atmosphere, clearly it impacts our breathing. We can feel it stinging our eyes, stinging our throat. You can feel it in your lungs if it's a really smoky day. We know that young people, elderly people, so children, babies and children, elderly people, and people with either respiratory diseases, people with heart or lung conditions, and people with diabetes are all more susceptible to the impacts of those smoky conditions. We also know that there's interactions with other respiratory diseases. There was huge concern in 2020 and 2021 when COVID was so prevalent in our society that there would also be interactions with wildfire smoke, and the consequences could be huge. It is well documented that during wildfire smoke inundations into communities, there is an increased number of hospital visits or doctor visits because of those respiratory diseases. We also know from research working with wildland firefighters and others who are often exposed to the smoke that it has long-term consequences for their health. Perhaps less obvious is kind of the impact of the trauma of fire onto people who are on evacuation alert or have been evacuated from their homes, or in the greatest cases, people whose homes and communities have burned. The cumulative effects of the uncertainty of evacuation alerts and orders, the trauma experienced by people who have witnessed or experienced fire burning into their neighborhoods and homes, and the long-term consequences on mental health and community well-being are things I think we're just truly beginning to get our heads around and beginning to understand. So finding mechanisms, ways in which we as individuals in our society can be proactive to be better prepared for fire has long-term benefits, not only for individuals, but for our society as a whole.
So speaking of mental health, as someone who is kind of on the field, the expert, obviously there are some silver linings and positives, but overall, how has it affected your mental health, kind of being in the moment?
That's a great question. I have to take a deep breath to be able to answer that question. And maybe the best way to answer that is maybe with a little bit of an anecdotal story. When people ask me about about wildfire and these types of questions. How does it affect my mental health? I often tell people that my life changed on July 7th, 2017. A cold front swept through the Cariboo region of British Columbia and ignited fires there were thousands of lightning strikes that ignited simultaneously more than 100 wildfires. Those fires were burning in the communities or near communities of Quesnel and Williams Lake and 100 Mile House and near the Escat First Nation and near the Hatsel First Nation. In Williams Lake itself, there were fires burning on the sugarcane reserve of the Williams Lake First Nation or the Tahalk people. There were fires burning in the community of Wildwood, in the neighborhood of Wildwood. And there was fire burning just across the Fraser River on the Hatsel First Nation traditional territory. My graduate students and undergraduate assistants were in the Williams Lake Community Forest that day working, and they were in a pocket of the forest where there was no radio reception. So for 2 hours while fires burned around them, they couldn't see the smoke yet and didn't know those fires were burning, but we also couldn't communicate with them to tell them that there was fire nearby and to draw them back into the community. They ended up leaving the community. Williams Lake was evacuated just a few days later for safety concerns, and it took months before we could go back and resume that research. That was really the moment that changed my research program and what we've been doing ever since. My focus since July 7th, 2017 has been around wildfire effects, forest recovery, community impact, working collaboratively with Indigenous communities and with community forests, given the urgency that became abundantly apparent after the 2017 wildfire season. In 2017, 1.2 million hectares burned in British Columbia. To our shock, in 2018, 1.3 million hectares burned. We thought we'd broken an amazing record in 2017. We exceeded it again in 2018. In 2021, when another 850,000 hectares burned, including those incredible fires that burned through Lytton and Monty Lake or Monty Creek. Those were shocking to us. And here we are again in 2023, where almost 2.4 million hectares. We have exceeded the 2018 record by 1 million hectares, only 5 years after that record was set. We've seen tens of thousands of people on evacuation alert. We've had over 400 fires burning for most of this fire season. Thousands of people have been out of their homes, and we're still counting, but we're going to have lost hundreds of homes in multiple communities in West Kelowna, in the region around Shuswap Lake, North Shuswap, and multiple smaller communities in the north have been impacted where homes and critical infrastructure have been disrupted. So how have these fires affected us? It's changed my professional life. It's changed my understanding of how urgently we need to be acting. I always thought that these types of impacts would be the next generation of fire scientists and forest experts who would be addressing them, and that I was laying the groundwork that would enable them to enact change. And what we've experienced in the last 6 or 7 years tells me that climate change impacts are here, that the impacts on wildfires and ecosystems are 30 to 40 years ahead of where I thought they would be, or where we as a scientific community thought they would be. And it speaks to how urgently we need to act. We know many of the good solutions. It's now a matter of mobilizing those, making decision makers, government agencies understand how urgently these changes need to occur, securing the funding for communities, Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities to act, to create the more resilient forests immediately around them, encouraging the forest industry. And I think that will require changes to government policies and regulations so that we can act more quickly across the broader landscape. The forest industry has to be involved. They are impacting 15 times more area every year than we have been able to achieve through proactive management, through fuels mitigation around communities after 20 years of this action. So we spend 15 times more putting out fires than we do on proactive fuels mitigation. We still harvest 15 times more land for economic gain, which frankly contributes to the problem, than we are in proactively restoring ecosystems and mitigating fuels on an annual basis. And that's costing us more than 15 times more money and costs to our society by dragging our feet and not acting in ways that are urgently needed, with future costs only increasing as climate continues to change and our impacts and wildfire impacts will continue, as we've seen this year and in recent years.
One thing I'm sure you may have many thoughts on when the mainstream media or the public speak about wildfires and their consequences, what kind of perspectives or conversations do you think are neglected or missing? I know in the last year, we've seen an uptick of like conspiracy theories and all of these things surrounding fires. So what do you think is really missing from this public conversation about the situation?
Wildfire is this real enigma. We have all watched on television and hundreds of people have experienced that it is a natural disaster of epic proportions when fire burns into our communities and burns down homes and threatens lives. At the same time, it is an essential part of ecosystems, and using fire to fight fire, using good fire to fight mega fires is part of the solution. And so there, I think, is the conundrum that we have with fire. How do we accept on one hand that it is a natural disaster that is incredibly threatening and on the same time part of the solution? I think it's very difficult for people, especially if you've been traumatized by fire, to accept that paradox around fire. And so in part, it's having people understand that component of the proactive measures. But also, I think from the conversation is for people to understand that we live in fire-prone environments, that we are vulnerable in those fire-prone environments, and yet there's many things individuals can do to make themselves better protected to fire or from fire. Some of the things that I really think are missing from the public conversation are, people searching for and enacting the solutions that individual homeowners can be putting in place. The discussion around how to be fire smart, how to make sure that burnable debris in and around your home is carefully managed, that in the spring and fall, as homeowners, we need to go up on our roofs and make sure that the gutters aren't full of fallen leaves that will dry out next summer and be the kindling that could catch your house on fire. That we make choices like not store burnable materials, firewood, lawnmowers, gasoline tanks for our lawnmowers under our wooden decks that are attached to our homes in a fire-prone environment during the fire season. Those are simple fire smart principles that we could be applying. Making choices when we're fixing up our gardens to put rock gardens immediately around our home and take the fire susceptible shrubs, the junipers that we like to grow that are beautiful and aromatic, or the cedars that also are beautiful and aromatic, but don't grow them right next to your home. Push them out into your yard away from their home so that you're not growing kindling right next to your house. And for those who are considering upgrades to their homes or are going to be building new homes, think about fire smart principles when designing your home and picking the materials. Put a metal roof or a fire resistant type of material on your roof because it's fire embers carried off of a wildfire on the wind that land in people's yards and on the roof of their house that catches your home on fire. And once the roof is on fire, it's very difficult for structural firefighters to put that house fire out. So imagine if we had fire-resistant roofing and no material in the gutters. That house is already 2 steps closer to being resistant to fire. Imagine if we also put fire-resistant sidings. Instead of using wood siding, choose other materials, stucco or types of board that are fire-resistant materials to prevent fire from conducting or heat conducting into your home and contributing to fire. Very simple solution that have been costed out to about $6,000 per home when you're building a home, about $6,000 extra in investment that would create a home that is fire resistant, given that so many of us live in a fire-prone environment. So fire smart principles, I think, are a giant first step that all of us could be taking, and a really important one that could make a difference for many, many homes and homeowners.
I'm optimistically terrified of the future. Rumneek, Jeevan, any thoughts?
I am also optimistically terrified about the future. But Lori was great at giving us a respectable amount of anxiety while also giving us hope. And I hope that I have given you both that as well upon my departure.
A healthy dose of anxiety from Rumneek on her way out, folks. We wouldn't want it any other way.
So that pretty much wraps it up. And I am very bad at being normal when saying goodbye, so I'm just going to follow Rumneek's lead and not do it myself.
I don't have much to say other than good luck, onwards and upwards, and I've been waiting many episodes to say this, but goodbye, Pod Squad. Girl, don't kill me.
Absolutely disgusting. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling your feels, please drop us a review. You can find me on Twitter at Carol Eugene Park.
And me at Rumneek with 3 E's.
And me at Jeevan Sangha.
From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Podium Podcast Company.